The question circled in my mind like a relentless storm. What if I fail? It wasn't just a fleeting thought. It had become a constant companion, a shadow lurking behind every hopeful idea and every daring dream. As a Black American woman standing on the edge of a new opportunity, the weight of that question pressed down on me with a quiet but suffocating force. It crept into my mornings, tangled with my prayers, and whispered doubts just as I tried to breathe life into my aspirations. I remember sitting in my small apartment, the afternoon sun filtering weakly through the blinds, casting long lines across my worn desk. A folder lay before me, details of a chance to step into something bigger, something uncertain yet full of promise. My heart raced with excitement, but just as quickly, the familiar fog rolled in. The question, what if I fail, wasn't just a thought. It was a mental barricade, a wall I kept bumping into without finding a door. It made my hands tremble and my breath catch, as if the very act of imagining failure was enough to freeze me in place. This wasn't the first time I had faced this kind of fear. It had followed me through years of dreams half-formed and risks half-taken. I knew the feeling well, the tight knot in my stomach, the racing mind that played out every worst-case scenario, the inner voice that whispered, "You're not ready," or "You don't have what it takes." It was a familiar fog, one that clouded my confidence and blurred the path forward until all I could see was uncertainty. This question, this weighty "what if I fail?" had become a silent adversary, threatening to stall all movement before it even began. Despite the fear, there was a flicker of desire deep inside me, a small flame that refused to be snuffed out. I wanted to reach for this opportunity, to open the folder and say yes to the unknown. But the fog was thick, and the question echoed louder than my hopes. It was like standing at the edge of a vast ocean, wanting to swim but frozen by the fear of drowning. Every time I imagined taking that first step, my mind painted vivid pictures of falling short, of being judged, of the painful sting of failure. The fear wasn't irrational. It was built on years of experience, and the harsh realities of navigating a world that often seemed set against me. What made it harder was the weight of expectations, not just from others but from myself. I felt the pressure to succeed, to prove that I was worthy, capable, and deserving of whatever dreams stirred in my heart. Yet, the louder that pressure became, the more the question, "What if I fail?" tightened its grip. It was a tug-of-war between ambition and fear, between the desire to break free and the instinct to retreat. Each time I thought about moving forward, the fog thickened, wrapping around me like an invisible chain. I tried to tell myself that fear was normal, that everyone faces doubts when stepping into new territory, but knowing that didn't make it easier. The question, "What if I fail?" wasn't just a passing worry. It was a storm that threatened to drown my courage before it could even rise. Trying to push it away only made it stronger, as if denying the fear gave it more power. I found myself stuck in a loop, wanting to move, yet unable to break free from the paralyzing fog. The internal struggle wasn't just about this opportunity. It was about trust in myself, in my abilities, and in the possibility that God was guiding my steps, even when the path seemed unclear. I wrestled with the fear that failing would mean I wasn't enough, that my dreams were too big or too fragile for me to hold. It was a battle between hope and doubt, and the question, "What if I fail?" was the battlefield. Sitting there, I realized this question wasn't just an enemy to be defeated, but a sign of the deeper fears that had settled in my heart over time. It was a mirror reflecting my insecurities, my past wounds, and the hard lessons life had taught me. I saw how this fear had shaped my choices, how it had held me back more times than I cared to admit. It was a fog that didn't just block my vision but whispered lies about who I was and what I was capable of. Yet, even in the midst of this heavy fog, a small voice inside me refused to be silenced. It reminded me that fear, while powerful, didn't have to be the final word. That question, "What if I fail?" could also be a doorway, a challenge to face the unknown with courage rather than retreat. It was the first step in a journey that would require me to look honestly at my fears, to understand where they came from, and to find a way to move beyond them. I knew this wouldn't be easy. The fog was thick and the question was loud. But beneath it all, there was a quiet hope waiting to be nurtured. I wanted to believe that stepping into the unknown, even with the risk of failure, was a step toward growth. That faith wasn't about having no fear but about trusting enough to walk forward anyway. As the afternoon light faded and evening crept into my room, I sat there with the folder unopened for a moment longer. The question, what if I fail? Still echoed, but now it shared space with a new thought. What if I try? It was a fragile hope, a tentative spark in the darkness, but it was enough to keep me sitting there, ready to lean into the discomfort, ready to face the fog instead of running from it. That evening marked the beginning, not of a finished story, but of a struggle I was willing to embrace. The question, what if I fail, might never fully disappear, but I was learning to see it for what it was. An internal fog that clouded my vision, but one that I could begin to confront. It was the start of a journey toward courage, toward faith, and toward the possibility that failure might not be the end, but a step along the way. That fog, the relentless question, what if I fail, was more than just a fleeting doubt. It was a dense, swirling cloud born from years of mental barriers I hadn't fully acknowledged. As I sat with that question lingering in the corners of my mind, I began to recognize that the fear wasn't random or baseless. It was rooted in something deeper, something I now call internal fog makers. These were the mental patterns and emotional roadblocks that distorted my view of what was possible. They didn't just whisper doubts. They shouted them, drowning out the small voice of hope that was trying to break through. The internal fog makers took many forms. They were memories of past setbacks, moments when I tried and fell short, when I felt unseen or unheard, when my efforts seemed to vanish into thin air. Each of those moments was like a pebble dropped into a pool, creating ripples that spread through my mind, mixing with self-judgment and harsh criticism until the whole surface of my confidence was murky and unclear. I realized that these fog makers didn't just exist in the present. They were echoes from my past, shaping how I approached every new opportunity. I recalled times when I had dared to dream but then recoiled in fear. Those moments when I was ready to speak up or step forward, only to be held back by an invisible force telling me, "You're not ready," or "You don't belong here." These weren't just random fears. They were rooted in real experiences of rejection, disappointment, and sometimes even silence when I needed encouragement the most. The internal fog makers thrived in that soil of insecurity, growing stronger each time I allowed those memories to define me. This fog distorted the very lens through which I viewed myself and my potential. It twisted ambition into recklessness, hope into naivety, and possibility into risk. The more I tried to imagine success, the more the fog thickened, making it almost impossible to see clearly. It was like looking through a window smeared with grime. No matter how hard I wiped, the dirt always seemed to return. This made every decision feel heavier, every step more uncertain. At the heart of this fog was a tug-of-war between two parts of myself. One was filled with ambition, a hunger to grow, create, and step into the purpose I felt stirring inside me. The other was paralyzed by fear, tangled in the memories of past failures and the harsh inner critic that whispered, "You'll never be enough." This internal conflict played out constantly, a battle between the desire to move forward and the instinct to retreat into safety. I began to see that these internal fog makers were like a thick mist that didn't just obscure the future. It also distorted my present. They made obstacles appear larger than they were and possibilities seem out of reach. I wasn't just battling fear. I was battling the way my mind had learned to protect me by exaggerating risks and minimizing my strengths. These fog makers had become default settings, and breaking free meant recognizing them for what they were, learned patterns, not absolute truths. What struck me most was how subtle these fog makers could be. Sometimes they appeared as a fleeting thought, other times as a heavy feeling of doubt that settled in my chest. They could be triggered by a simple question or a reminder of past disappointment. But no matter how they showed up, their effect was the same. They clouded my vision and drained my confidence, making the path forward hazy and intimidating. I realized that these internal fog makers were not just personal struggles, but were also shaped by broader experiences. Being a Black woman navigating spaces where I often felt unseen or underestimated added layers to this fog. The societal messages I had absorbed over time about who I was supposed to be, what I was capable of, and where I belonged fed into the internal narrative that fueled the fog. It wasn't just about me. It was about the weight of history and expectation pressing down, making the fog feel even thicker. Yet, naming these mental barriers as internal fog makers gave me a new perspective. Instead of feeling like I was fighting an invisible, unnamed enemy, I could now see the fog as something tangible, something I could observe and understand. This clarity was the first step toward reclaiming my vision. It helped me realize that the fog wasn't a permanent state, but a condition that could be challenged and over time cleared. Understanding the source of the fog also helped me begin untangling the knot of fear and ambition inside me. I saw that ambition wasn't reckless. It was a seed of purpose waiting to grow. And fear, while powerful, was often a protective mechanism born from pain and past wounds rather than a signal to stop. This reframing gave me permission to hold both hope and fear at the same time, rather than pushing one away to favor the other. As I sat with this awareness, I felt a subtle shift. The fog didn't vanish, but it became less suffocating. I could acknowledge the presence of doubt without letting it dictate my every move. I started to notice moments when the fog lifted just enough for me to glimpse new possibilities, even if only briefly. Those glimpses were like cracks in the clouds, promising that the sun was still there, waiting to shine through. I also began to recognize the importance of patience with myself. The fog had been building for years, and it wouldn't disappear overnight. But every time I noticed an internal fog maker, I could choose to respond differently, to refuse its invitation to retreat and instead stay present with the discomfort. This was a new kind of strength, a quiet resilience that didn't rely on the absence of fear, but on the willingness to face it. This journey into understanding my internal fog makers was painful but necessary. It revealed the complexity of the fear I was experiencing. It wasn't just about a single opportunity or the risk of failure. It was about breaking free from patterns that had held me captive and distorted my sense of self. It was about reclaiming my vision and trusting that I could move forward, even when the fog was still swirling around me. I knew this was just the beginning of a longer process. The internal fog makers wouldn't disappear with a single insight, but naming them gave me a foothold. It was a step toward clearing the haze and finding a clearer path through the uncertainty. With this awareness, I felt a flicker of hope, that maybe, just maybe, I could learn to navigate the fog rather than be trapped by it. I decided to face the fog head-on, to stop letting it control the narrative swirling in my mind. The first step was surprisingly simple. I began to journal. It wasn't about crafting perfect sentences or finding immediate answers, but about pouring out every fear, every doubt, every trembling whisper of "what if I fail?" onto the page. I thought maybe if I could see these fears outside of myself, I could understand them better, maybe even weaken their grip. Sitting at my desk with a blank notebook, I hesitated at first. The fog was thick, and the act of confronting it felt like stepping into a cold, dark room. But as I wrote, the words came tumbling out, raw and unfiltered. I wrote about the times I had stumbled, the moments I felt invisible or inadequate, the harsh self-judgments that had become a soundtrack in my mind. I wrote about the weight of expectations, both from others and self-imposed, and the paralyzing fear of not measuring up. Each sentence was a small crack in the wall I'd built around my hope. What surprised me most was how honest I could be when the thoughts were just between me and the page. I didn't have to hide the shame or pretend to be stronger than I felt. I could acknowledge the deep-seated stories I'd been telling myself for years, stories of inadequacy, of not belonging, of failure as a defining mark, rather than a momentary setback. These stories were the fuel for the fog, and seeing them in black and white made their power seem less absolute. As I continued journaling, I began to notice patterns. Certain memories and beliefs kept resurfacing, like a loop playing on repeat in my mind. I saw how past failures weren't just isolated events, but had become lenses through which I judged all future possibilities. These memories were intertwined with harsh self-criticism, a relentless voice that told me I wasn't enough. It was exhausting to admit, but naming these stories was like pulling weeds from a garden. They had taken root deep, but they weren't invincible. In those quiet moments of reflection, I started to give a name to the fog, internal fog makers. Naming the fear and doubt transformed them from vague shadows into identifiable obstacles. It was no longer an amorphous cloud, but a battlefield where I could recognize the enemy. This naming gave me a strange sense of control, as if by shining a light on these fog makers, I could begin dismantling their hold over me. I realized that these internal fog makers weren't just about external failure or rejection, they were about how I internalized those experiences. They were stories I had accepted as truth but were often distorted by emotion and fear. Recognizing this helped me see that the fog was partly a product of my own mind, shaped by past pain but not necessarily an accurate reflection of my present or future. Journaling also became a tool for self-compassion. Instead of beating myself up for feeling afraid or uncertain, I started to write with gentleness, acknowledging that these fears were understandable given my history. This shift was subtle but powerful. It allowed me to hold the tension between hope and fear without collapsing under the weight. I was learning to be a witness to my own struggle, rather than a harsh judge. This practice of honest self-talk and journaling didn't make the fog disappear overnight. There were days when the question, "What if I fail?" still echoed loudly, and the fog felt impenetrable. But each time I returned to the page, I chipped away a bit more at the silence and isolation that fear thrived on. I found that expressing my doubts openly was an act of courage, a way of refusing to be controlled by unspoken fears. One entry captured a breakthrough moment. I wrote, "These fears are old stories, not facts. I am not defined by my past mistakes or by the voices that doubt me. I can choose to rewrite the narrative." This was a turning point, not because the fear vanished but because I began to refuse its final say. I was learning that fear and faith could coexist, that courage wasn't the absence of doubt, but the decision to move forward despite it. Through journaling, I also started to identify specific internal fog makers, the patterns of thought and feeling that repeatedly clouded my vision. There was the perfectionism that whispered I had to be flawless to succeed. There was the imposter syndrome telling me I didn't belong. There was the fear of disappointing those who believed in me, which often felt heavier than the fear of my own failure. Naming these patterns helped me prepare for them, like knowing the terrain before a difficult climb. Acknowledging these fog makers made me realize that I wasn't alone in this struggle. I saw how many others wrestled with similar doubts, carrying their own fogs shaped by past wounds and harsh expectations. This shared experience made my fears feel less isolating and opened a door to empathy, not just for others but for myself. I began to understand that the internal fog was part of the human journey, especially for those of us navigating complex histories and identities. Journaling became a sacred space where I could pause, reflect, and confront the truth of my fears without judgment. It was a reminder that the journey through the fog wasn't about pretending to be fearless, but about facing the truth of my internal struggle with honesty and grace. Each word written was a small act of defiance against the fog's claim on my vision. As I continued this practice, I noticed subtle changes. I became more aware of when the fog was creeping in, more able to name it in the moment rather than being swept away by it. I found moments of clarity breaking through the haze, brief glimpses of the path ahead, of possibility beyond fear. These moments were fragile but precious, like the first light of dawn after a long night. The act of naming the fears and journaling them also made me more intentional about how I spoke to myself throughout the day. I started catching the negative self-talk earlier, gently challenging it, and replacing it with affirmations rooted in truth rather than fear. This wasn't a magic cure, but it was a steady process of reclaiming my narrative from the grip of the fog. In embracing this process, I realized that the battle with the fog was as much about mindset as it was about action. It was about learning to live with uncertainty and fear without letting them dictate my choices. It was about building an inner resilience that could hold both hope and doubt, discomfort and courage. This chapter of my journey, marked by honest self-reflection and the practice of naming the internal fog makers, became a foundation. It gave me a clearer view of the battlefield and a renewed sense of agency. I was beginning to understand that the fog, while formidable, was not invincible. It could be confronted, named, and gradually diminished through awareness and truth. Though the fog still lingered, those moments of clarity sparked a new determination within me. I was learning that the fog was not the end of the story but part of the process. And with each honest word written, I was reclaiming my voice, my vision, and my courage to step forward despite the fear. As I wrestled with the swirling fog inside me, I found myself reaching for something steadier, a source of strength beyond my own fragile resolve. The doubts and fears were real and loud, but I longed for a deeper reassurance, a reminder that I wasn't navigating this alone. So I turned to prayer, opening my heart honestly to God, laying bare my fears, my hopes, and the heavy question that haunted me. What if I fail? Prayer wasn't a magic cure that erased the fog, but it became a lifeline, a way to anchor myself amid the storm of uncertainty. Speaking aloud my fears felt like admitting the truth to a trusted friend who could hold my trembling heart without judgment. I prayed for courage to face the unknown, for clarity to see beyond the fog, and for peace to rest in the midst of chaos. It was in these quiet moments, away from the noise of my own mind, that I felt a gentle presence, a reassurance that steadied my soul. Alongside prayer, I turned to Scripture, searching for words that could speak directly to the fear gripping me. One passage kept rising to the surface. Isaiah 41 verse 10. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Those words were like a balm to my weary heart, a promise that even when the fog was thickest, God's presence was a steady light guiding my steps. Reading that passage, I felt a strange paradox. Fear didn't vanish, but it was met with a deeper trust. I realized faith wasn't about having no doubts or worries. It was about choosing to believe in God's support despite them. It was a decision to lean into the discomfort rather than flee from it, trusting that every step, even the uncertain ones, was held in divine care. This shift in perspective was subtle but profound. The fog didn't suddenly clear, but I began to see it as temporary clouds rather than permanent storms. I understood that God's promise wasn't about guaranteeing an easy path, but about walking with me through the hard terrain. This gave me a strange peace, a quiet confidence that whatever happened, I was not alone in the struggle. Prayer and Scripture didn't just offer comfort, they also challenged me to act. Faith called me to move forward even when the way wasn't clear, to take steps not because I was fearless, but because I trusted God's presence in my journey. It was a call to courage rooted not in my own strength but in divine support. In those moments of prayer, I found myself speaking the fears aloud, naming them like I had in my journal, but now placing them in God's hands. I am afraid, I whispered. I don't know what will happen, but I trust you to guide me. This act of surrender felt like releasing a heavy burden, a way of saying, I cannot do this alone, but with you I am brave enough to try. I also began to find encouragement in stories of others who had faced fear and uncertainty with faith. Their testimonies were reminders that the journey through doubt was not unusual or shameful, but a shared human experience. They showed me that faith was a journey marked by small acts of trust, by choosing to step forward when the path was unclear. This growing awareness deepened my relationship with God, turning prayer from a last resort into a daily practice of connection and courage. Each time I felt the fog creeping in, I learned to pause, breathe, and turn my thoughts toward God's promises. This spiritual discipline was not about escaping reality, but about finding strength to live fully within it. I noticed a shift in how I talked to myself during these times. The harsh inner critic that once screamed, "You're not enough," was met with gentle reminders from Scripture and prayer. "You are held." I would say softly, "You are strengthened." This ongoing dialogue was a lifeline, a way to reframe the fog not as a sign of defeat, but as a challenge to be met with faith. The promise in Isaiah wasn't just words on a page. It became a living truth that reshaped how I faced each day. Even when fear stirred, I could recall that God's righteous right hand was holding me steady. This gave me courage not to wait for perfect conditions, but to start moving forward with trust. Prayer also opened my eyes to the importance of community. I sought out friends and mentors who could pray with me, who could remind me of God's promises when my own faith wavered. Their support was a tangible expression of God's presence, a reminder that I was not meant to face the fog alone. Through prayer and Scripture, I learned that faith is not a shield against doubt, but a steady hand to hold through it. It is the quiet assurance that even when the question, "What if I fail?" looms large, there is a greater story unfolding. A story where I am upheld, strengthened, and guided. This spiritual foundation became the soil in which my courage could take root. It didn't erase the fog, but it gave me a way to live with it, to move forward with hope despite uncertainty. I began to see faith as an invitation to step out of the shadows of fear and into the light of trusting God's presence every step of the way. In this new rhythm of prayer, Scripture, and honest conversation with God, I found a growing resilience. I wasn't waiting for the fog to lift completely before I acted. I was learning to walk through it, supported by a faith that promised I would not walk alone. And that promise made all the difference. Despite the reassurance I found in prayer and Scripture, the fog remained thick around me. The question, "What if I fail?" still echoed, sometimes louder than ever, threatening to pull me back into hesitation. But I knew that waiting for a perfect moment, a clear path free of doubt, was a trap. So I made a commitment, not to leap into the unknown all at once but to take small, deliberate steps forward, even when fear pressed close. I decided to dedicate just 5 minutes a day to the goal that both excited and terrified me. 5 minutes felt manageable, short enough not to overwhelm, yet enough to build momentum. Those minutes became a quiet rebellion against the fog, a way of saying, I will not be paralyzed by fear. Each day I set a timer and focused on one small task. Reading an article, brainstorming ideas, making a phone call, or jotting down a plan. It wasn't about perfection. It was about forward motion. Those 5 minutes were often the hardest part of my day. My mind begged me to stop, to return to the safety of inaction. Doubts surfaced. Is this worth it? Am I wasting time? What if I'm not good enough? But I pushed through, reminding myself that momentum doesn't come from giant leaps, but from consistent, faithful steps. Sometimes my heart raced and my hands trembled as I worked, but I kept going. I noticed that during those minutes, the fog seemed to lift just enough for me to see a glimmer of possibility. It was like clearing the lens of a camera, allowing me to focus more clearly on the task at hand. Those brief moments of clarity became fuel, encouraging me to return the next day. Progress wasn't dramatic, but it was real and tangible, and that mattered more than I realized. Sometimes I stumbled in this process. There were days when 5 minutes stretched into hours, driven by bursts of inspiration or energy. Other days I barely managed to meet the timer's call. But the key was consistency, not intensity. Each small act of obedience chipped away at the fog, weakening its hold and building my confidence bit by bit. This commitment also brought awareness of the internal battle happening beneath the surface. Even as I worked, the internal fog makers whispered their doubts, trying to steal my focus. I felt the tug of hesitation and the pull of old stories about failure and inadequacy. But each time, I chose to acknowledge the fear without surrendering to it. I reminded myself that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Taking these small steps was a form of faith in action. I wasn't waiting for all conditions to be perfect. I was trusting that God's presence would guide me through the uncertainty. That trust was fragile, but it was enough to push me forward. I learned that momentum comes not from flawless plans or total certainty, but from simple acts of obedience in the face of doubt. I also began to appreciate the power of routine. Those 5 minutes became a sacred space in my day, a moment set apart for nurturing my dreams. This rhythm helped me move from being a passive dreamer to an active participant in my own journey. It was a small but significant shift, one that gave me a growing sense of agency and purpose. As the days turned into weeks, I noticed changes beyond the tasks themselves. The fog that once felt impenetrable started to show cracks. I felt less overwhelmed by the question, what if I fail? And more curious about what might happen if I tried. The internal dialogue shifted from, can I do this? To what if this works? That small change in perspective was a breakthrough, a sign that the consistent effort was transforming not just my actions but my mindset. These 5-minute sessions also became moments of reflection. After each one, I paused to acknowledge what I had accomplished, no matter how small. Celebrating these tiny wins became a way to build resilience and counterbalance the negative voices in my head. It was a practice of gratitude for progress, however incremental. This process wasn't without setbacks. There were days when the fog felt heavier, when doubts threatened to overwhelm, and when progress seemed invisible. On those days, I reminded myself that growth isn't linear and that rest and patience were also part of the journey. I learned to be gentle with myself, understanding that persistence included embracing the ebb and flow of motivation and fear. Through this commitment to small, consistent action, I discovered a new kind of courage, one rooted in faithfulness rather than grand gestures. It was a courage that said, I may be afraid, but I will keep moving. This courage was quieter but no less powerful than the bold leaps I once imagined. It was the steady heartbeat beneath the noise of fear. As I dedicated myself to those 5 minutes a day, I began to see the fog not as an immovable barrier but as a challenge to be met with patience and persistence. Each small act chipped away at the paralyzing weight of doubt and built a foundation of trust in myself, in the process, and in God's guiding hand. This stage of the journey taught me that momentum is born from consistency. It showed me that fear doesn't have to stop me. It can coexist with action. And it reminded me that even the smallest steps forward can open doors to new possibilities. The fog was still present, but it no longer held me captive. Instead, I was learning to move through it one deliberate 5-minute step at a time. Day by day, those 5-minute commitments began to weave a new pattern in my life. A rhythm that chipped away at the fog and reshaped how I saw myself and my possibilities. The small acts of courage that once felt so fragile gained strength through consistency. What had started as a hesitant step became a steady march forward, each moment building on the last. Momentum was taking root, subtle but undeniable. I noticed how these tiny victories, though modest, accumulated and transformed my mindset. Where doubt used to dominate, hope began to take hold. The question, "What if I fail?" still hovered, but it no longer had the final say. Instead, it was met with the growing evidence of progress. The small wins, the completed tasks, the moments when fear whispered but I chose action. This quiet collection of successes shifted my internal narrative from one of limitation to one of possibility. With each passing day, I grew more aware of the resilience being forged in the crucible of persistence. The fog that once felt impenetrable now showed cracks, and through those cracks, I glimpsed new courage and clarity. I was learning that momentum doesn't come from perfect conditions or sweeping changes, but from the faithful repetition of small deeds done with intention. Each act of obedience became a foothold on the path out of fear. This emerging momentum also reshaped my relationship with failure. Instead of fearing it as a definitive end, I began to see failure as part of the learning process, a necessary step, not a final verdict. The fog didn't disappear when I stumbled, but my response to it changed. I was slower to retreat and quicker to recognize that setbacks were invitations to try again, to adjust course, and to keep moving forward. Through this process, my self-trust deepened. I started to believe not just in the goal but in my ability to pursue it, even when the fog thickened. The internal dialogue shifted from harsh judgment to gentle encouragement. I caught myself saying, "You're making progress," or "This is hard but you're still here." These affirmations didn't erase fear, but they softened its grip and invited courage to grow alongside it. This momentum wasn't only about the tasks or goals themselves. It was about the transformation happening within me. I saw how small, consistent actions were reshaping my identity. From someone paralyzed by doubt to someone who could engage with uncertainty and still move forward. The fog was still present, but it no longer defined me. I was becoming a woman who could hold fear and faith in the same hand. I also noticed how this momentum spilled over into other areas of my life. The confidence built in those 5-minute sessions infused my daily interactions, decisions, and relationships. I found myself speaking up more, taking initiative in small ways, and embracing challenges outside my comfort zone. The fog's reach was shrinking, and with it, the limits I had accepted about myself. This growing resilience was a quiet revolution. It wasn't marked by dramatic breakthroughs or sudden clarity, but by a steady accumulation of faithful effort. Each day I chose to act, I was rewriting the story I told myself. A story of persistence, courage, and hope. The momentum became a force that propelled me forward, even when the path remained uncertain. Reflecting on this journey, I realized that momentum is a powerful antidote to fear. It builds a foundation of trust, not just trust in God or the process but trust in myself. I was learning that faithfulness in small things creates the conditions for breakthrough and growth. The fog didn't have to be overwhelming when met with consistent, intentional action. This transformation also deepened my understanding of patience. The momentum I was building was slow and steady, requiring me to resist the urge for quick fixes or immediate results. I learned to honor the pace of growth, to embrace the seasons of waiting as part of the journey, rather than obstacles to be overcome. This patience was itself a form of courage, a willingness to persist through discomfort without losing heart. The momentum gave me a new lens through which to view my dreams and fears. I could see that movement forward, no matter how small, was meaningful. It was a declaration that I was more than my doubts, more than the fog that clouded my vision. Each step was a testament to my resilience, and a beacon of hope for the path ahead. Through this experience, I gained a deeper sense of identity rooted in perseverance and faith. I was no longer defined by the fear of failure, but by the courage to keep moving despite it. The fog remained, but now it was a backdrop to a story of growth and transformation, not a barrier stopping me in my tracks. This journey taught me that momentum is not just about achieving goals. It's about becoming the person who can face uncertainty with grace and strength. The daily choices to show up, to act, and to trust are the true markers of progress. They build a resilience that carries us through the fog and into the light. With each small victory, I felt a growing confidence that no longer depended on circumstances, but on a steady rhythm of faith and obedience. The fog might still cloud the horizon at times, but I had found a way to navigate through it, one intentional step at a time. Facing the fog had become an ongoing journey, one that demanded patience, faith, and persistence more than quick wins or easy answers. I learned that battling the internal fog makers wasn't a one-time victory, but a continual process. A daily choice to confront fear instead of avoiding it. Each day brought new challenges, fresh doubts, and moments when the question, "What if I fail?" threatened to regain its hold. Yet, through this ongoing struggle, I discovered profound lessons about resilience and trust. Patience emerged as one of the hardest but most vital lessons. The fog didn't dissipate overnight, nor did clarity come in a sudden burst. Instead, progress was slow and often imperceptible. There were days when I felt stuck, as if I were taking steps forward only to slide back into old patterns of doubt and hesitation. Those moments tested my resolve, tempting me to give up or settle for comfort over growth. But I learned that patience wasn't passive waiting. It was an active endurance, a steadfast refusal to be defeated by the fog's persistence. Faith too took on new meaning. It wasn't about having all the answers or feeling fearless. Rather, faith became the quiet decision to trust God's presence and guidance, even when the path was unclear and the fog was thick. This trust was often fragile, shaken by setbacks and fears, but it grew stronger through daily acts of obedience and prayer. I realized that faith is not the absence of doubt, but the courage to move forward in spite of it. Persistence became a companion on this journey, a commitment to keep showing up, to keep taking small steps even when the outcome was uncertain. I understood that progress was rarely dramatic. It was the accumulation of consistent effort that gradually eroded the fog's power. Each moment of persistence was a declaration that fear would not have the final word, that I was willing to do the hard work of growth one step at a time. Through this ongoing battle, I gained insight into failure itself. I began to see failure not as an endpoint but as a necessary part of the process, a teacher rather than a judge. When I stumbled or fell short, the fog didn't vanish, but my response shifted. Instead of retreating into shame or silence, I learned to view failure as feedback, an opportunity to learn and adjust. This reframing softened the fear of failing and opened space for courage to flourish. I also discovered the importance of self-compassion in this journey. The harsh inner critic that had fueled the internal fog makers needed to be met with kindness and understanding. I learned to speak gently to myself, recognizing that fear and doubt were human experiences, not signs of weakness or failure. This compassion became a balm for the heart, helping me to persevere without being crushed by self-judgment. This ongoing struggle deepened my awareness of the complexity of fear. It was never just a simple obstacle to overcome, but a layered experience intertwined with past wounds, cultural expectations, and personal history. As a Black woman, I carried additional burdens. Messages from society that often questioned my worth and belonging. This awareness didn't make the fog lighter, but it helped me understand its origins and gave me courage to challenge its claims. I came to see that battling internal fog makers required more than willpower. It demanded a holistic approach, mindset, faith, community, and action working together. It was a daily practice of choosing courage over comfort, persistence over surrender, and trust over fear. This multifaceted journey was neither linear nor neat, but it was real and transformative. Importantly, I learned that this battle was not meant to be fought alone. Seeking support from others, friends, mentors, and faith communities became vital. Their encouragement, prayers, and shared wisdom were reminders that the journey through the fog is a shared human experience. This community became a source of strength and accountability, helping me to stay committed when the fog seemed dense and the path unclear. Through facing the fog rather than avoiding it, I gained a deeper understanding of myself and my purpose. I saw that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it repeatedly. I realized that progress is made not by giant leaps, but by steady, faithful steps taken with intention. The fog was not a sign that I should stop, but an invitation to grow in resilience and trust. This ongoing process reshaped my identity. I was no longer defined solely by my doubts or fears, but by the courage I showed in confronting them. I became a woman who could hold uncertainty with grace, embrace vulnerability, and continue moving forward even when the outcome was unknown. The fog remained, but it no longer held dominion over my vision or my heart. I understood that battling internal fog makers is a lifelong journey, one that requires continual courage and action. There will always be new challenges, moments of doubt, and fears to face. But I had learned that these moments were not failures. They were opportunities to deepen faith, build resilience, and grow in self-trust. This transformation also deepened my empathy for others wrestling with their own fogs. I saw how common the struggle is, how many carry hidden fears and doubts that cloud their paths. This awareness fostered compassion, for myself and for those around me, reminding me that courage often looks like simply continuing to show up. Ultimately, I learned that the question, "What if I fail?" is part of the journey but does not have to define it. Facing it with honesty, faith, and persistence opens a path through the fog. The battle with internal fog makers is ongoing, but it is also a journey toward freedom. Freedom to pursue purpose, embrace possibility, and live with courage despite uncertainty. This ongoing struggle has become a testament to the power of faithfulness over fear, persistence over paralysis, and hope over despair. It is an invitation to keep walking forward, even when the fog remains thick, trusting that each step is part of a greater story unfolding. If you find yourself wrestling with the paralyzing question, "What if I fail?" know that you are not alone. That fog of doubt and fear is a common companion on the journey toward purpose and growth. But here's the truth I've learned. Those fears, those internal fog makers, only hold the power you give them. You have the ability to challenge them, to name them, and to push back with small, consistent acts of courage. I want to encourage you to start where you are, no matter how thick the fog feels. Identify your own internal fog makers, those thoughts, memories, and doubts that cloud your vision and stall your steps. Write them down if it helps. Naming them is the first step to seeing them for what they are, barriers, not truths. Then take small steps each day. You don't have to have all the answers or take giant leaps. Momentum is built one deliberate action at a time. Maybe it's 5 minutes of focused effort, a short prayer, a moment of honest reflection, or a conversation with a trusted friend. These tiny acts of faith and obedience begin to chip away at the fog and open a path forward. Remember, the journey through fear and doubt is not about being fearless. It's about moving forward despite fear. It's about choosing to trust even when the path is uncertain and the question, "What if I fail?" still lingers. Faith doesn't promise an absence of struggle, but assures you of God's steady presence every step of the way. Lean into prayer and scripture as sources of strength. Let God's promises remind you that you are not alone, that you are upheld, and that courage grows in community and connection. Surround yourself with people who encourage your faith and hold you accountable to your journey. You were never meant to walk through the fog alone. Be patient and compassionate with yourself. This process takes time because it's about transformation, not just achieving a goal, but becoming the person who can face uncertainty with grace and persistence. Celebrate your small wins and remember that every step forward, no matter how tiny, is progress. You might stumble and the fog might thicken at times. That's part of the journey. What matters is that you keep showing up, keep naming the fear, and keep choosing faith over paralysis. Momentum and breakthrough come from this steady, faithful action, not from waiting for perfect conditions. I want to remind you that your story matters. Your dreams are significant. The fear you feel is real but not insurmountable. You have within you the courage, the resilience, and the faith to move forward. The fog can be thick, but it is not impenetrable. You can step through it one small brave step at a time. So start today. Identify your fog makers, commit to a small act of courage, lean into your faith, and surround yourself with support. Momentum begins here, with humble trust and persistent movement forward. Your purpose is waiting on the other side of fear, and each step you take is a declaration of faith that your story will be one of hope, growth, and breakthrough. If you love the story, like the video and subscribe.